Well, sweet. Well, I'm Josh. Hello. It's been a while since I've been at the Ember meetup. Glad to be here. I've been getting to do some Ember recently on my side projects. So it is a standalone Pocket-like article tracker and sharer and stuff like that, because I read way too many articles, and so I want to own the data myself, and I didn't want to pay a cent. And as a developer, rather than paying a little bit of money to Pocket, I wanted to spend large amounts of time writing it for myself. So you guys know how that works. So as part of this, and kind of on the side, I looked into Ember-Orbit recently, and so I want to share about it. I blogged about it. I kind of went through the tutorials, but one of the things about, so Orbit is well, we'll talk about it. Why don't I just go through the slides, because I prepared them, so we'll do that. I'm Josh. I'm coding it wrong. If you haven't connected to me on Twitter, I think I'm just, thank you, yes. I think I'm just Jay Justice on Tech404, so you can find me there. I work here at Big Nerd Ranch. We have a website called The Frontier. It's screencasts, not Ember-specific content, but there's general web content. I like to write about, like I was talking before, about software craftsmanship, testing, software design, and so there's some React and some Vue.js stuff there, but like the talks I have on like refactoring and testing and stuff like that applies to Ember just as much. In fact, my whole view of testing in other ecosystems comes from Ember and acceptance tests and component tests and things like that. So if you want to check it out, you can have a free 30-day trial. You can email thefrontier@bignerdranch.com and send me ideas for Ember screencasts that I could put on there. It'd be fun. This is not an advertisement for Firebase, but jumping in, actually, I'm supposed to be showing presenter slides. How do I do that? I don't remember what I have to say, so let's just show the presenter notes. Nope. You can see all the secrets. One moment. Let's unmirror. This is informal. I could show the presenter notes. Yeah. So we're talking today about alternatives to Ember data. I really like Ember data. I tweeted out just recently that Ember data is actually one of my favorite parts of Ember, like having that connection to the back end built in, being able to operate on conventions like JSON API or other RESTful approaches. To be able to easily talk to backends is really, really, really nice for building in an agile way, building small apps and being productive really quickly. I was trying to do some side projects in other frameworks just to get to know them. And once I got to the point that I was wanting to interface with like multiple models in the back end, it got really discouraging for me because I was having to custom write connections and identity maps to connect these things together. And I was like, why am I doing this by hand when it already exists in Ember? And so to me, Ember data is one of the big draws of Ember. But it's not for everything. So there's other other libraries you can connect with as well. And so if you need to do something with offline data, if you need to do something with synchronization, or like real-time data transfer, Firebase, of course, is the technology that a lot of people reach for across many different platforms, native, web. And so there's an official Ember add-on called Ember-Fire that you can use for that. And so that's something you can do. If you want to plug that in place of Ember data, you get your real-time updates. It's really, really nice. One of the things about Firebase, though, for me, there's a couple things. It's a proprietary platform, so the data lives on Google servers. It's not standards-based. It's just kind of a proprietary product. I just don't make any money with my projects, and so I can't afford to. I don't know if Firebase costs any money, but I just need to build things as simple as possible because I do not know how to start a business. All of you founders out there and CTOs, I don't know how to do that. I just make hobby projects. But I would really like to have another option, something that's standards-based. Something that's open source, so I can just run it on Heroku or on my DigitalOcean server. And something as well, so Firebase uses NoSQL data storage. I come from a relational database background. I like the guarantees that a relational database provides. And so I would love to have an option for offline storage synchronization, but then kind of allow me to have that relational database backend on the server side. And so Orbit, I kept getting drawn back to, there's like a gravity joke somewhere there. I kept getting drawn back to Orbit as I was thinking about this, because it's really the solution that I know of out there as far as a library that does these things that I'm looking for. So Orbit is a general JavaScript library. It's developed by Dan Gebhardt, who you might know from the Ember community. So he's on the Ember core team. He was involved with the JSON API specification that came out of the Ember world, and JSON API resources, which implements JSON API on the back end for Rails. So he's been involved with all of these projects. So very bought into the Ember community and these kind of approaches. So it makes sense that he's working on other things that fit this kind of philosophy and mindset. And so Orbit is a project he's been working on. As I was starting to say, it's a general JavaScript library, but there's also an Ember-Orbit add-on that you can use to make it easier to use in the Ember world. And you might have gotten interested in this, like I did at EmberConf this year. Dan was talking. He was talking about kind of the role that that Orbit plays in Ember, and said that Orbit is to Ember data as Glimmer.js is to Ember. And really what he was getting at is the idea that, Orbit innovations are happening there, and then in some form, they're going to make it into Ember data. I'm not 100% sure all of what that entails. I don't know if he committed to, I'm working on the new version of Ember data, and it is going to be Orbit. He didn't make that 100% clear. But, those innovations that's the future of data in Ember, as his title his talk was titled. He did have a quote here that I think is helpful for how to think about it, is that Orbit and its ecosystem can provide a laboratory for experimentation for some of the more advanced data features that are kind of, I wouldn't say expected, but more advanced apps might want to have. But this is an experiment that you can actually be a part of now because Orbit exists. Ember-Orbit exists. You can plug it in. But I think the laboratory for experimentation phrase is helpful. So I went through the tutorial, got it set up. It was really nice. I tried to convert my hobby project over to Ember-Orbit, and some parts of it went really well, but I started running into some challenges. It's not yet established to the point where everything is there, it's fully convention-based, everything works for you out of the box. You're gonna need to dig in. I would say if you're looking to adopt Orbit or Ember-Orbit, you're gonna wanna be ready to really learn it deeply. You're most likely gonna be in the source code. And so, there's a Gitter channel for help. You can get on there, get help and advice. But, there's not a bunch of EmberConf talks about it. There's not a bunch of blog posts about it and Stack Overflow posts the way there is about Ember data. So that's just something important to know if you're thinking about adopting Orbit for something you're working on. I think the thing for me is that Orbit is the solution that I want to be there and I want to use because I want to have, again, that open source standards base. And so it's something that I'm excited about continuing to look into. So it exists, Ember-Orbit exists at github.com/orbitjs/Ember-Orbit. You can look it up. It gives you the kind of Ember add-on approach you'd expect, where instead of having to hand code a big JSON configuration from scratch, you're creating individual files in different directories in your app directory. Ember-Orbit picks them up and wires them together for you. So it makes integration easier, but you are a phrase that Dan uses a lot with Orbit is giving you primitives for these kind of data flows. And so you're putting primitives together, like the concepts to say, I want data here, I want it to be synchronized in this case, I want it to block and wait for an update in this case. So it's a lower level than you're used to with Ember data. You're wiring up these primitives together, and we're going to walk through what that entails in a little bit. One thing that I've found, anytime you're working with offline storage and synchronization, it can be hard to visualize what's going on. And so when I was kind of trying to learn it myself and go through a tutorial, I wanted to see, put in a piece at a time, a piece of these primitives at a time, and see what functionality it was given to me at each step. And that helped me get some of the concepts, correct some misconceptions I had, and so that's what I'd like for us to do together. We're gonna live demo it, and so that's exciting. You can edit this video afterwards if it goes terribly wrong. We'll see what happens. But yeah, so we're going to jump into Ember-Orbit. I've done a little bit of pre-work to pre-install, just because you never know with NPM how fast it's going to go. Let's hide that confidential client stuff. Good times. Oh, that was on this screen. It's fine. No problem. So yeah, I've pre-run a couple commands up here. Do I have a cursor? There you go. So I started with the new Ember app. I installed Ember-Orbit. I uninstalled Ember data, which is kind of scary, but that was fine to do, and that was cool. And then there's several different packages. Because it's component-based, you install different Orbit packages for different functionality you're going to take advantage of. And so we have indexed DB for local storage within the browser. IndexedDB bucket, so that we'll talk about what buckets are. They kind of save in-flight requests that have not succeeded yet. And then Orbit JSON API, so that's the server connectivity to our JSON API. I do also need to start up our server, so let me do that real quick. It's Rails, as you might imagine. That's the way these things go. So increase that font size. Is this gonna work? Yeah. So we started the server there. The backend, the backend here is a typical Rails JSON API server with one difference. So we've set it up. This is based on examples in the Ember or in the Orbit documentation. Instead of using integer primary keys, as is typical in Rails, we're using UUIDs. And so the reason for this is one approach. When you have records that can, we're actually going to get to the point in our app where we have records that are created offline when you don't have any connectivity. And so by using UUIDs, the client's able to assign an ID that's not going to conflict with anything on the server side. Another alternative you can do is to actually have integer primary keys, but then have another ID that's the UUID, or maybe it's vice versa. Yeah, I think, yeah, you can have another UUID field so that the client can keep track of those records it's created, but then when they go up to the server, the integer comes in. So a few different ways to do it. Okay, so our app is not working. Good times.
You already have it working.
Yeah, it's already there. It's the super confidential client work. I don't actually test this stuff out beforehand. I gotta get my work in until the last minute. Yeah, that's up on the screen. Good times. Can you even see the client name in there? That's good. We're just gonna skip right past this and learn how to use Final Cut Pro. All right. This is like a casual environment. That was a lot faster. Great. Cool, so we got our server up, and we're not going to need it right away. Okay, so back to it here on the Ember side. Looks like that's just about all we did. Yeah, we added, we uninstalled Ember Data, we installed the Ember-Orbit add-on, and then we just did plain npm installs for these packages, for these various things that Orbit's going to be connecting to. And then we've started up our server. So cool, I'm going to look at my blog post here, because I can't like remember anything off the top of my head. We are going to import, because these are npm packages, we are going to use Ember CLI build to import them. Has anyone used that new add-on that's come out in the last week or two for automatic imports of npm packages in Ember? It looks cool, yeah. So you guys can tell me if you've done more of this, if this is typical, but the instructions say this is how we're going to add these packages. We're going to add Orbit indexed DB. Bit indexed DB bucket, and then add right in my way Visual Studio Code.
I know, it seriously doesn't do anything.
Yeah, you can check. Well, since you can get rid of it, and in fact, I'm gonna do it right now because you said do it. All right, let me see if I can remember. I think it was. This might. I thought turning this off would have actually stopped the suggestion, so let's just uncomment all my things. I don't know which one this is, so you can play with it afterwards, but I know when I had all of these uncommented, just don't help me at all. I don't want any help. Let's try it. There we go. Yeah. I'll send you the settings. It's like, that's takeaways right there. That's good. Okay, cool. So now we're going to restart our Ember app, and that should load those up just fine. All right, so what I want to do is gradually build up our configuration for Ember-Orbit. So we're going to start out just storing records in memory in the browser, like some other JavaScript frameworks would do, and that's all they give you. Then we're going to go and replicate the functionality of Ember Data so that we're, for live connections to the server side, we're reading data and writing data. And then we're going to add in some of the offline functionality. We're going to create a model, and it's starting up, so that's fine. We're going to create a model, and models are actually created differently. It's an Orbit model rather than an Ember Data model. This is going to be a messaging app. Just type of like a text messaging app with offline storage, which is kind of interesting. You can kind of, on the subway, you can compose all those messages and it'll connect later. So in here, we're going to import, as not dissimilar to what you do with Ember data, we're going to import model attribute, but instead it's from Ember-Orbit. No, that autocomplete's still there, isn't it? Yeah. No. Yeah. So we're going to do model extend. So in this case, yeah, and so similarly, they're going to declare your attributes. I feel like Ember data does not require a type to be given. I think Orbit does require you to say that the type is a string. I haven't tried it without it, but that's what they tell me to do. So yeah, another trivial model, like, pretty similar to what you see in Ember data. So let's go ahead and we're going to set up our typical route and controller and template and stuff like that. So that part's not too exciting. I suppose I could have had that ready in advance, but we get to do it together. And video is cheap. So I'm just going to manually create index. And we're going to do, no, we're going to have lots of typos. You're going to watch me. It's going to be great. I'm going to need to turn on video mirroring because I'm going to need to actually see this in front of me. I'm so prepared. Isn't this great? Thank you. High fives. Okay. Okay. All right, so typically I generate this, but I don't. Okay, so we got our model hook here. So you can actually Ember-Orbit provides some of the same API that Ember Data does, and so you could use a find all as you usually do. But I'm going to use the more idiomatic Orbit way of doing this, just to kind of show some of the options you have. So you can do return this.store, which is now an Ember-Orbit store rather than Ember Data store. There's a method called live query. And so this allows you to say, okay, I want to query something from the back end, but as changes happen, I want them to be, I want my UI to be updated and refreshed, just like you're used to. You pass a function to this. We're going to use an arrow function. You get the object you're passed is like a query object, so we'll just call it Q. And then here you say Q.find records of type message. And of course, all the documentation for this is available on the Orbit website to understand it a bit more in detail. But this, as you'd be used to, this is good. Give me all the messages, and that's my model, and let me know when they change. So that's all straightforward. We're going to make a template. Is the font size okay, by the way? Thanks. This template is going to be just like what you're used to. I don't think there's any real differences in here. You've got a form input where you can type in your message. You got a button, add message, you can say send. It's fine, and then we have a list of all the messages, and we're not going to style it because that is not the way I roll. It's going to look super ugly, which is great. So just as usual, we got our model there, which is going to be a array-ish, list-ish of messages. We can just loop through that, and then in each one. And just as usual, the promise-based nature of it is hidden. You don't have to worry about that. You can access the model as though the array is already there and ready for you. We're going to output the text. Okay, and now we need to add that add message action on a controller because we're going to use controllers. So you can have opinions on that if you want. Not anymore, is that what you said? Yeah. All right, so we got our add message action. We're going to say, okay, so now here's the add command. So we got this.store.add record. And we pass in, so this format's a little bit different. In this object literal here, we pass the type of message and then the other attributes as well. Like we say, actually, let me put it on the line. That'll be easier. We say text is this.new message. And then we don't actually need to call save separately. So the way persistence happens is all configured inside of Ember-Orbit, and there's lots of ways to do it. So at the level that it's exposed to the rest of your app, like whether a record is saved or not, like the application code, like the controller or component level code, isn't really concerned with that. So you'll see as we go along how persistence happens in Orbit differently. For the sake of our app, we're going to do set new message. Nope. to the empty string. Cool. So let's run the app. This should be working now as far as just storing the data in memory. Ember-Orbit has a default in-memory store. So again, like just in memory on your page in the JavaScript, that's where the data is going to live unless you configure anything else. And so, our app should be working with this running now. So let's go over to Chrome. Let's load it up. Nope. Hey, hooray! What have I done? I can at least remove this. Okay, it was just not visible. So we have a little, very little, now it's a little bit bigger, box for sending a message. We can type something in all caps. Click send, it gets added to the list. So it's stored in memory, but that's all that's happening so far. So we have not yet gotten to the point of doing what Ember Data provides, so let's get there now. Let's connect to our JSON API backend. We'll do that first, and then we'll add the local storage functionality from there. So to do that, we start to configure, so now we get into the more of the Orbit concepts. So there's a concept called a data source. So we create a data sources folder under our app. And in here, we're going to create one, we'll call it remote. So we're saying in addition to the default in-memory store, we're going to have a remote store now as well. So we import a JSON API source, which is a class that's provided by Orbit, specifically by the JSON API, Orbit JSON API package. And then now we follow kind of a format that it specifies to allow this to be created. And we need to send out an object that has a create method on it. We use the word injections here, which I think just really means the kind of configuration parameters we're going to pass to this JSON API source. But you can add additional configurations here. So we can say injections name, we can name it, and this is going to show up in the logs you're going to see, so we can see what data is flowing to where. We just call it remote. Injections.host, and so we need to tell it where to go. We're going to go to our typical Rails API, port 3000, and then we need to create it. We need to return a new JSON API source. Getting a little bit fewer auto-completions there. That's nice. Injections. Like, it's okay.
Why do you have to default
This? I don't know. That just came from the code that I was given. Hey, we're live coding. Why live code unless you can break it? So we're going to take it out and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
It might be that nothing's passed in. This gets into either Orbit setup or maybe some Ember internal setup. It's not an initializer, so I'm not really sure.
You're creating the source.
Yeah, this is a method. It's like a factory object. So this is a method that the Ember-Orbit can call to create the source that you want to create. Lets you do. So it's a kind of initializer, just not a standard Ember initializer.
Yeah, and maybe like the chain together or something like that.
Yeah.
And so maybe.
That's not hooked up, by the way. Yeah, sorry. I should have known this would be interactive. Wasn't thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
So this might not work, so that we'll find out.
Yeah, we'll see. We're not ready to run though. So we need to. So the store is here, but again, we're composing these primitives, so we need to tell Orbit what we want to do with this source. And so a data strategies is that needs to go at the application level. And so we need to configure a strategy that tells it how to configure data flow between different sources. So we'll call this one remote update. So we want to, when a change is made locally, we want that to be pushed to the remote store as well. So that's the first thing we'll implement. So we need to import a request strategy from Orbit coordinator. So this is in the core of Orbit itself. So we do create. Oops. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Patrick. Like this configuration like this is not Ember typical, and so that's something that's a bit of a different feel. So we're going to return a new request strategy, and so now we got to send some values to it. So name the strategies for logging purposes. We can call this remote update. So we want to specify the source that this is performed on. So store is the name of the default in-memory store. On before update. So there's a number of different events that occur in the life cycle of like data requests and transformations in Orbit. Before update is one. So like before, when you're updating the store in memory, before you do that, do this. And what we want to do is to target the remote source, we want to perform an action. The action is push. So we want to push these changes to that remote source before we save them in the local store. And one more thing, we'll get into blocking later, but for now we'll say blocking true, which is basically like make sure that remote request to save the data succeeds before you do it locally. So it's like we don't want to get to the point where the user thinks the data has been stored, but it hasn't actually made it to the server. Until later when we add offline functionality. So yeah, this kind of demonstrates the approach of using Ember-Orbit. Like you're not hand writing, you know, fetch requests and things like that, but you are hand configuring it. Like you're setting these configuration options to wire these things together, to connect these primitives together.
This request strategy, is that like just making requests to a server, or is that like what is a request?
I have
Lifecycle of some data. Request.
Yeah, that's not something I've gotten enough into to be able to fully present it. You probably want to get in, but Orbit does recommend kind of getting a sense of these primitives and how they connect together. So if you dive into their docs, you can see. We're going to see another example of a sync strategy, so synchronization strategy.
Oh, I see. That's
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm still not 100%, like I was going through the tutorial, I was trying to get to the point where I could explain exactly, here's what this strategy does and here's what this one does. I haven't been able to fully follow it yet, so I'm kind of following in the paths that are recommended by the tutorials so far. Yeah. All right, so there's one more thing we need to do is like we need to, so Orbit has what's called a coordinator, which is the object that kind of takes all these conventional things that are set up in these conventional directories and looks for them and wires them up together. So it's the coordinator, but we need to manually activate it. And there's a reason they allow us and make us manually activate it. We'll see that a little bit later. But for now, let's just do it. Again, I really should have used generate command, but here we are. As service, our old friend. All right, so we got a route. This is our application route, so this will always be run. And then we asked for the data coordinator service. So this is Ember-Orbit's coordinator. And then in our before model hook, what we're going to do is we're going to activate. We're going to do coordinator. Where's this? In fact, let's just simplify this right now. This.dataCoordinator.activate. It might be a promise, so it might be good for me to return it. I'm not totally sure, but we'll do that. So again, this seems like why wouldn't they do this when your app starts by default? But we'll see why. We're going to want to, a little bit later, we're going to want to perform some steps before we start the coordinator up. So let's save this right now. And I think we should be at the point where we've replicated Ember Data's functionality. So let's check here. We'll pull up our network tab, make sure we've reloaded our app. So now when I type something in and save it, this is a fetch. Okay, this is the options request. I think this is the Rails app starting up. I think I saw my app does not like to switch between Ruby and JavaScript. It takes a little while. So let's just start it up one more time. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, so we made a 201 post. It succeeded. We posted the data to the server. Again, you can see that UUID ID if you squint and look at that font size. But we got a success response back. So we're now saving that data to the server. But if you notice, when we reload the app, we're not loading the data yet. So we need to implement that. We need to wire up the loading ourselves. So let's do that next. Actually, before that, I was going to do one other thing. You can also set up console logging. So you don't have the Ember inspector for viewing, that works with Ember Data to see the data that's in the Ember Data store. That doesn't work for Ember-Orbit, so console logging can be a helpful way to see the progress of the operations that are happening, especially when you have some complexity set up as far as data synchronizing and things like that. It can be a helpful way to trace it. So that event logging is just another strategy. We can create that. So we can say import event logging strategy. Default, create, strategy. This one doesn't really need any configuration options. You just return it, and you're good to go. So now when we reload the app, we pull up the console. Is there a way to, yeah, oh, look at that. All right. So you see here, when we start the app up, we have a store before query and then store query. So this is saying that a query is being run on the store, the in-memory store. If we dive into here, I think we can probably see, yeah, the operation is find records, and the type is message. So that's what we want to give all the records. But you can see it's not pulling this data from the server yet. And so that's what we can set up next. Oh, I do want to show, when we add a record, we can see we're going to get a bunch more console entries. So there's a whole bunch of them. If you go through them, there's some before stuff, but then you can see there's a remote push here. And this is saying, okay, what are the operations? We're adding a record, and the record is this stuff. Can we see which server it's going to? Not clearly there. But yeah, so there's a lot of detail here, and I haven't dug in enough to like be able to get my mind fully around, here's exactly the sequence and why before update runs here and things like that. But you can at least pick out things like, I can see that it is in fact being pushed to the remote server here. And of course you can check that in the network console as well, the network panel. So now to do what I've been saying a couple times now and query the data from the server. So this is going to be another strategy. We can call this one remote request. So like request the data from the server. And is this, yeah, so this is going to be a request strategy again. And in this case, see what you were saying about typos. Good thing it's not embarrassing ones. Yes. Cut that from the recording. New request. I should have turned off that autocomplete. Would benefit it. Okay, so we want to name it remote request. And what are we going to say? We're going to say the source is our store. So again, we're primarily operating on our in-memory store. And we say on before query. So when I ask my in-memory store for some data, before you query there, go do something else. Instead, we go to the target, the remote server, and we perform an action, we pull. So we're pulling data from the remote server into our store before we query the store for the data. And that's what Ember, well, it's actually, well, the sequence will be able to set it up differently. This way, we say go to the remote server and get the data back before we return it to the user interface. Ember data works a little differently, but we're going to change it up a bit later to be able to do that. We're saying blocking true, and that's the part that I just said, where we say get it from the remote store first, wait on that before you return it to the UI.
The only difference here between the remote update was the action was closer to the
And that's the difference, and then the on, before query and before update. So you're connecting to different commands.
Those are like parts of before query, before update, and after this is
Yeah, they're different. They're lifecycle events on Ember-Orbit things. Yeah. Here we are. Cool. So we can reload our app. So so we reload our app. We can see, is it pulling? Yeah, it's doing a remote pull. So it's requesting data from the server, and if we check the network tab with my big font, we can see that a get is being done. Decrease that font just a little bit. We're getting data back in the response, but it's not showing up in our UI. So there's one more step we need to do, and this kind of gets it, just shows that this is, a bit lower level than we're used to with Ember data. We need to do a synchronization, and so the best way I can explain this is, there's literally a remote server. There's like the Rails server, but then there's this remote data store that lives in memory in our Ember app. And so when we do this pull, it pulls it into our local remote store, but it hasn't been synchronized over to our main store called store. So we need a synchronization, a sync task that sends the data that's over here over to here as well. A diagram would have been a helpful thing for me to put up on there. But yeah, so again, this is just lower level kind of to wire these things together. So, yes, yes. There's the local store, the local remote store, and then the remote store, if that makes it clear. Okay, so we have a sync strategy here.
Local remote sits between the local store and the remote store.
Yeah, it's like,
kind of reminds me of Git,
yeah,
you know?
it's just like Git.
Smooth stuff.
Yeah. Interestingly,
Git ref logging, if you will.
I haven't gotten into this, but Orbit has the possibility to fork stores to make changes and then merge them back together. So you can do this too when you've got like a form, maybe a complex form where you're editing a bunch of data. And it does this in a performant way. And so you can be editing that data. It doesn't affect your centralized store. And then you can merge the trees or merge the stores back together, and that kind of goes out atomically and makes the updates.
Should we call it Orbit?
Or gets nice. All right, so we gotta.
You want data or get?
All right, so we gotta configure, because that's what we do. We remote sync. So then the configuration of this one is simple. We say, okay, the source is the remote store. The target is the store. Huh, seems like we might have a guest. Yeah, maybe. Thanks. So we're gonna say, so we say, hey, like from this remote store, sync the data from there into our main store, the in-memory store. Blocking is false, so it's not going to be waiting on it. It just happens asynchronously. I just kind of follow the example for that. I'm not actually sure what would happen if I changed that to synchronous. It'd probably be pretty simple, pretty similar. But let's do this. Cool. So now, after we request that data, it should be syncing up. And sure enough, when we reload the page, we can see that the data is being put on screen. And so now our data should be behaving the same way that Ember data does. As we type stuff in, it shows up right away. We can see a 201 there that is sent to the server. And then when we reload the page, it comes back up. So there's a lot of work to re-implement Ember data. Good times. So if you just go to here, then why are you using Ember-Orbit? You should be using Ember data. But here's where we can go on from here. We can continue to build using these same primitives to add other functionality. So right now our app requires us to be online. So if our server goes down, if it's not accessible, we reload the page, we get an error, as you might imagine. And it says, yeah, failed to fetch. So we tried to go to the server, it failed out, and our app shows those white screen of death. So this is what we're going to start to work with to improve. So of course, if you wanted your, right now we're still running the Ember server. If you wanted like your application code to be accessible offline, you could use Ember Service Worker to get the browser to cache it. But right for this purposes of this talk, we're just talking about Ember-Orbit. So assuming you've got Service Worker going and you've got your application code there, or assuming your application is running fine, it's just the API, the data storage API that's not coming up. What can you do? So there's a few different options we can follow here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another store. This is going to be called Backup. And so this is going to be an IndexedDB data store, so the data is stored in the browser. So we're still going to have the main one called store. That's our in-memory one. It's just just JavaScript objects, and so that's going to be the most performant and works in the most typical way. But that data is going to be backed up to IndexedDB, so it's available when we reload the page if we're offline. So this is going to be, first we need a new data source. And part of the idea here is that all of these sources operate in the same way. There's the similar kind of primitive that's put together. So we're going to import IndexedDB source. And these are abstractions that you can build on and implement your own sources and strategies. And so with browsers come up with another cool storage technology, you can implement one. Or Dan Gebhardt can implement one, or somebody else can, to be able to plug this in so you don't need to reinvent the whole stack. You just invent add an adapter. For right now, it's IndexedDB. So we're going to export default, create injections. Apparently, we did not need that default object there, so that was cool. We learn something every day. So we're going to try that again and just push our luck. So we're going to name this one backup, not minus equals. Injections namespace. So we're going to add a namespace here, and I believe this is going to show up. I haven't worked with IndexedDB directly, but I think this gives it a namespace to make sure it's not going to collide with other IndexedDB types of data in the in the browser storage. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, database or schema name. It's also scoped to the application, so it's not like I can just choose Facebook.com and get all their data or anything like that. So yeah, it's configured to have a namespace. Yeah, I don't know. Good times. Cool. So we have a data source. As you probably anticipate, like we need to wire it up to get data flowing around. So we're going to do another sync strategy, another synchronization. And we're going to do this one, call this one store backup. let's just copy this to get a starting point. So this sync strategy, we're going to call it, again, store backup. The source is going to be the primary in-memory store. The target's going to be the backup. So again, if I haven't been explicit about it, these names here are the names that you configure for the different sources. So that's how it's getting references to them to know how they connect. And we're going to do blocking true. So we're going to make sure, this is going to be happening in real time, and we're going to make sure that the data going to the in-memory store is also backed up to IndexedDB before we proceed on, before we let the user know that the promise has been fulfilled and the data is available. So we'll set that up as blocking. So let's see here. So now, that backup was wired up. We're going to start the Rails server again. And it's going to take a second. Need a girl from Ipanema to play here. This little soundtrack while waiting for it to load. I think my antivirus is running. Anyone else have to have antivirus on the computer? Man, that's awesome.
Any virus in Mac?
Yeah, I know.
Has it ever done anything?
It's used a lot on my CPU.
So no,
It's probably mining Bitcoin. Yeah.
it's a while loop, so that
Yes.
computer's on fire.
Yes.
Money Bitcoin, that's what it's.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. All right, cool. So we reload the app. Oh yeah, it's my Rails has to wake up. Reload the app. The data comes up as before. But if we go in Chrome in our Applications tab, you can see here under IndexedDB, we have messages. I think that's the name of the namespace that we gave it. And then we have like a message table underneath there. Oh, and this is showing all my data from before. So I did not. Let me clear it out and reload it again, just so it's not confusing. Yeah, so now these 5 records that we see here are also backed up in IndexedDB. So we've saved them there, but at no point, we're not retrieving the data from backup at any point yet. So we need to do something to actually take advantage of this data.
So you made a request to remote into the local remote, the store, and the store and
That's right. Simple. Yeah. Cool. So what we want to do, oh yeah, so there's a few different things here. So we can configure this to be blocking, and that means that, oh, actually, hang on a second here. We're looking at the remote request. So our goal is to be able to get our data offline. So let's just see what happens if we go offline now. That is, we take the API offline. So let's do error-driven development. We'll find out what errors we get to figure out what we need to fix. So we reload it here. Even though we've got this backup, our app is still crashing because it's still making, in addition, there's a few things going on, but the most obvious thing from the error is we're still making that remote request, and when it errors out, our app just blows up. And so the first thing we want to do to fix that is just a simple configuration change. We want to say this remote request strategy is not blocking. So it's a blocking false. So this means that before we do a query against our local in-memory store, it's going to try to pull it from the remote. But if it fails or takes a long time, the app's not going to wait on it. It's going to proceed ahead. Now there is also error handling functionality you can add into Orbit. It's set up that way, and so you could alert the user or keep a log of it to kind of retry something later. But for now, we're just going to get our app up and running by setting blocking to false. So now, I mean, the app's automatically reloaded it, but as we try again, we can see that this network error is still happening, and it's uncaught, but the app is loading up. So our app, we're no longer getting the white screen of death, but we're also not getting our data yet. So that's going to be the next step. As you might imagine, we're going to need to explicitly set up a strategy to pull the data out of the backup and put it into the regular in-memory store. And actually, it's not a strategy. So the typical way to set this up is actually on application boot. So this is the reason that Orbit is set up, and Ember-Orbit is set up for you to need to explicitly activate the coordinator, is because you might want to do this data restoration before you do it. Again, like I don't know enough about the internals to know why this happens at this point, but this is kind of the recommended way to do it. So what we're going to do in our application route, when our app starts up, we're going to get this backup source. We're going to say const backup equals, oops, we're going to need the coordinator. Coordinator equals this data coordinator. Save a few characters. So for the coordinator dot get source backup. So again, the coordinator has access to all the things. Coordinator. And so we're getting that backup source that we've configured. And then from here, we're going to do backup.pull. So this is using an Orbit command that says, pull the data from this backup source, which is the IndexedDB. We get a query object again, so we need to specify the query we want to do, and we're just going to say find records. So we just say, give me all the records in the backup, and then we're going to chain that promise to say then, and let me get this typed out and then I'll process it. So we get a transform, which a transform is a series of operations that are done, and so this is basically like, give me all the operations that are required to kind of set up the data in the state that the backup is in. And then we say this.store.sync transform. So we say synchronize that series of operations into the in-memory store. So again, as you remember seeing before, this.store is the default in-memory store, and backup is the secondary store that we have explicitly pulled up from here. And then one more thing, and after this is done, that's when we're going to do coordinator.activate. The stuff that we were doing before. So the idea here is that like once the coordinator is activated, it's going to be looking for any changes that are happening and moving them around and stuff like that. This pre-step to restore the backup is kind of like, hey, just when the application starts up, let me get everything ready to go, and then we give the coordinator the control. So this is sort of like a one-time step we do upon application initialization. The other thing that's helpful as you're thinking about like the sync command, like how does this sync method relate to the sync strategy? So Orbit has functionality to do individual commands to like take these operations and these transformations and send them around between different data stores. Strategies are kind of like a high-level abstraction over those. So because data synchronization, because making requests is so common, like strategy is an abstraction that's added to you, you can just set it up through configuration here. But when you need to drop down to a lower level, as we do here, you can just run like individual sync operations. And of course, elsewhere in your code, you're going to want to run queries like find records and things like that. Again, this is not an introduction to all the concepts to be able to have them all in your head, just to give you a taste of kind of what this looks like in your application code. All right, so we're now restoring this backup upon the application starting up. And so remember, we have our Rails API is offline. It's not available. So when we start up the app, we see that our data is coming up. That net request is being made. It's erroring out, but our data is successfully being restored. I think if we look in here, let's see if that's being logged out. I'm not sure if it is. Store query, I don't see a reference. I think it's the reason that backup synchronization is not being logged, I think is because event logging is set up as a data strategy. And that gets started when the coordinator gets started. And so this operation that happens here is before event logging is set up. You could probably console.log and get a little logging out of things. So we're not going to do that right now. Cool. So now we're able to read our data while we're offline. So that's really cool. Like, this is new. This is different. And this might be as far as you want to go. You say, oh, I don't want to handle storing data offline, but like you can read it. Like if it's pulled down, you can pull up the app later, and that'd be cool. So right now, if we try to write data, I think we're not getting an error message because the network error has already happened, so it's already given up on talking to the network. That's interesting. It would be nice if it was getting a more explicit error there. But regardless, outgoing network requests are not happening. And so let's say while offline, so that's being sent. And just to confirm, let's start up the Rails API. Let's make sure Orbit's not doing anything too magical and it's not synchronizing that data back up to the server ourselves. Because again, like my goal in this is I want to see these things fail so that when I've gotten it wired up to do it, that I can see that it's now succeeding. So I'll let Rails start back up. Show me that port 3000. Come on, you can do it. All right. So now we reload it. And we don't have any errors. I think it's waiting to wake up. So all the things have continued. But we see that while offline record has not shown up. So that one's been lost. We tried to save that while we were offline, and it's disappeared into the errors. So we want to make a change. So what can we do to... So Orbit will actually give us facilities to keep track, because it's like a event-based or operation-based system. It has built-in primitives to keep track of, you tried to add this record, and I'm just going to hang on to that for you and retry it later. Like those abstractions are there. But we need to wire it up to be able to do that. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, and we'll show you how to do that. So the first thing we need to do is to make that remote update strategy, we need to make it non-blocking so that the app is not going to error out when we do it while we're offline. So what's going to happen here, let's see if I've remembered this right. we're going to turn the API back off. And again, it loads up while offline. So now, the network error, was that trying to make a post? I don't think it was. So now while we're offline, the record showed up in the user interface. Problem is that this is a lie. So this, Orbit has not kept track of this. The error is persistent. So like the in-memory store has this record and it is not on the server and is not going to be on the server. And we can, just because of Rails startup time, I won't go back into that, but trust me on that, that it's not yet at the point where it's going to be saved and sent up to the server. We need to do a little bit more configuration first. So this is where that bucket concept comes in. So I mentioned that before. This whole separate set of folders for data buckets. And a bucket is, I'm sure there's the Orbit docs have a better description, but it's basically the journal of like, here's in-flight things that have happened that have not yet succeeded. And it keeps track of them for you. So we're going to call this one main, because we really just need one data bucket. We're going to import index.db bucket. All right, and we're going to export default with an object with a create. No parameters needed for this one, and then we're going to go in here. And actually, this is why the namespace is helpful in this case, because this is, even though this is stored in IndexedDB, it's a totally separate thing than like your standard data tables. And so messages bucket is going to be a separate thing. Yeah. So now, and we do need to kind of do some manual wiring up of these things. Initializers, did I spell that right? I guess we'll find out. If y'all have worked with Ember initializers more than me, then this kind of setup may be more familiar to you. But we need to actually inject this bucket into our application. But this is a standard Ember initializer, as far as I've been told. I've never written one myself. We do application inject. And what these three parameters mean, I looked up before this and promptly forgot. But you can trust the Orbit documentation that this is setting up things. I did comment them out and saw that things failed. So I know that it's, that isn't necessary. Map name. Okay. I think the mnemonic I gave myself is, for inject is, when a data source asks for a bucket, give it this one. Does that seem like that might be what application.inject does? I don't know if y'all ever use custom initializers like this.
The thing you want to make into what the thing is.
Cool, okay. Sounds good, okay. So yes, this is what's required to get the bucket where it needs to be, and then that should be it. This is actually the last thing. So what we're gonna be able to do, so let me, again, like even just thinking through how to run this stuff to test it when you've got offline and synchronization gets a little confusing. So let me see here. We've got Rails stopped. Let me start it back up and make sure that this while offline record gets confirmed that didn't actually save properly, because at this point, like, you know, that code's already run. So even though we've added in the bucket, like it's too late. That is gone. That is not gone. Okay, so this is, yeah, it's the offline backup. So again, like this is interesting when you've got a stateful front end like this. All of a sudden, like, okay, well, I got to make sure the data is what I expect it to be and things like that. So it gets a little confusing. There's a lot more possible combinations of states and cases as opposed to just a page refresh. Reloading everything from scratch. So you need to, even with the best tool, like you need to be thinking through if the cost of the complexity is worth the benefits for your app. I don't know. I don't know if a hard refresh would clear out the storage stuff. I think there was an add-on. Yeah, this was an add-on recommended to me. I don't know what it is. Yeah, Clear Cache. Yeah, that you can set it up to clear stuff like IndexedDB. Cool. Okay, so now we cleared out our cache. We're connecting to the real server side. We're pulling down these records and stuff like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop Rails, reload, make sure it comes up. This should not disappear. It's there. As we reload while we're offline, it's still there, even though we haven't been able to connect yet. I think as Rails is coming back up, it's a little finicky just because, again, I need my Rails to wake up. I think I'm actually gonna, to make the demo look better, I'm gonna like manually hit it just to make sure Rails actually wakes up. Yay. Okay, so now, what we should see here, so let me, yeah, let's, again, we get the statefulness, like we gotta see it. I'm gonna open up the Rails console and we're gonna confirm that this record is not there on the server side yet, and then when we reload, we're gonna confirm that we can see it. All right. Oh, I got a big font size. See it? Good old favicon. Favicon errors. Okay. Message.all. Let's do message.pluck text. All right, so these are the messages that are on the server right now. The server is now up. So now when this is not like a real-time thing, so like WebSockets are not set up, at least in the Ember-Orbit stuff that I've done so far. So it's not like it has already noticed that the server is there and started syncing things up. But when you run it yourself or when you reload the application, this stuff should boot up. And what we're hoping happened is this bucket has kept track of the fact that we created this record and that it has not successfully made it to the server yet. And we're hoping it's just going to restart and kick it back off.
Can we see that?
Dang it! What do you want to see?
I was gonna say, can we see the MSD?
We should.
The actual thing there, what's that?
Let's.
Let's see if it's there now first.
Dang it. All right. We will go back. So let's see if it's there. So all I did was reloaded the page with the data there that was added when I was offline. And we do see it there. But so let's do it again and take a look at the state of the bucket and the state of things so we can kind of follow it. So what I'm going to do, again, I'm going to get my head around this. I'm going to take the server offline. I'm going to go head over to there and see. Yeah, so we see under IndexedDB we have messages and messages bucket. So yeah, so this is so interesting. Like I have not actually dug into this before. So we can see that for each of our stores, backup, remote, and store. So those are just the names of the ones we created in addition to the default. It's got a log and requests, and it looks like backup has a sync one as well, and store does, maybe related to things that we did. So let's see what happens here. So Rails is offline. What will happen? Save it. We've got to refresh it here. I don't think it has a remote requests. Okay. Let me move this down to the bottom. We can see that there's one request, a push, and the push includes the operation add record, and the record has this data, including the UUID. So that's what's stored, and that's what's gonna continue to retry when you start your app, and that will eventually get cleared out of the bucket once it's succeeded.
This is triggered we haven't used refresh page. What if we were to add more? So we'll just start zooming back up and add another message. Would it seem good?
Ooh, we're gonna try all the edge cases. That's good. That's smart. Let's find out.
I mean, otherwise, someone got offline, they come back online. You know, I don't know if that
Yeah.
phase six.
I'm sure there's a way to manually kick that off.
Waiting for
Yeah, yeah. I just haven't played with that. Yeah.
what's it called? Service record? In the background?
Sure. Yeah. Service workers solves everything, right? Yeah. Okay. So did I already mess this up? Yeah. No. We have what will happen was that record that we did while we were offline. And like, no, seriously, what will happen? We haven't refreshed the app or anything like that. Rails is online. No, seriously, what will happen? So, let's refresh this. It might be because things had already failed earlier, and so it's just given up when connected to the. Yeah, I don't think that's inherent to Orbit. I think it's probably related just to the fact that I'm not like error handling at all, but I don't know for sure.
I guess if you're kind of
Yeah. Yeah. Be good to experiment. This repo is on GitHub. Pull request welcome. So feel free to give it a try. Cool. So yeah, so again, look, go back over our journey here. So we started, we've built up a system involving offline, involving synchronization from these primitives that Orbit provides. It's more work than having something available for us by convention. It's more work than an all-in-one solution like Firebase, but it has allowed us to have those advantages of working on standard protocols, having the back end ourselves, owning our own data. And the idea is, and it is, there's different preferences, right? So some folks might say, at this point, I just want to write it myself. Like I want to use fetch, I want to store the data in memory, and I want to have total control. It's like, but like, as complex as, there were some pieces together to put this up, but we were still getting, when you can say synchronize these things and it just happens, like I've tried to write manual synchronization code. It's like, it's a little complex. And so, getting this functionality by hand would certainly be a lot more complex and error prone than what we have here. So this is Orbit. This is the options that Orbit has available, and it's something that's worth checking out. Just a few quick notes. This has gone so long. I'm so sorry. A few other things that are built in, like error handling for when operations don't work, like as we said. Informing the user in the UI when records aren't saved to the server. So especially in a web context, like people might assume, like I'm in a web browser, like the stuff is there, it's online. And so in the UI showing that something is not yet saved, maybe a manual retry button could be an option that you could provide for users. You get into a lot of user experience stuff that I haven't played with, certainly not in a tutorial context.
Yeah.
Other questions, thoughts, feedback?
So I think it's really cool. I think it's really cool that you were able to dig into it and make something else. Because I haven't seen them before.
Yeah. Yeah. Glad to. Well, sweet. Thank you guys for letting me show it. Appreciate it.